episode is brought to you by the Consultancy Growth Network. As you'll know, I'm a big believer in learning from people who've achieved the things that you want to. It's why I run this podcast, to share the stories of consulting leaders and how they've got to where they are today. So when I started talking to Mark Jansen and the team at Consultancy Growth Network, it was clear there was an obvious fit between Climate Consulting and their mission and what they are building with their network. But you're probably asking, what is the Consultancy Growth Network? The Consultancy Growth Network is the leading community of boutique consulting leaders. It brings together seasoned consulting growth experts who successfully scaled their own boutiques, with rapidly growing consulting founders looking to emulate their success. Now, you might be thinking, who are these growth experts? What do they actually know about consulting? And this is one of the most exciting things that personally I find about the network. The team at the Consultancy Growth Network have searched far and wide for some of the best boutique consulting leaders to help their members on their journeys, some of which I have previously interviewed for this podcast, such as Don Morehouse and Augusto Negrillo. But it's not just the insights from these people that you will benefit from. By joining, you get access to their jam-packed calendar of regular in-person and online events, their comprehensive growth hub of resources, and their active Slack community. Through all of these channels, you can learn, solve challenges, and achieve the goals you want for your firm. And now, if that wasn't enough reason to sign up, the Consultancy Growth Network is giving all listeners to this podcast a special sign-up offer. If you join for 12 months, you join for that next year, you will get your 13th month for free, giving you that extra month to continue to build on everything you're learning and continue to benefit from the network. To sign up, just visit consultancygrowthnetwork.com or contact their partnerships director, Luke at consultancygrowthnetwork.com. And when you're talking about joining, mention Create Engage or Climate Consulting, and you will get that special sign-up offer. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Climate Consulting. In this one, I get to speak to someone who I've known a long time and who was actually one of the first ever clients at Create Engage back in the dark days of COVID. Since then, his business has gone from strength to strength and is a phenomenal success story and full of so many lessons for you if you are looking to grow your consultancy. In this one, I speak to Stu Packham, CEO of Alchemist, the learning consultancy that he joined back in 2019 when it was just a small, recently acquired business with quite a question mark over its future. He and the team did a hell of a lot and turned that business into a 20 million global consultancy in just 5 years. And it's this journey that is packed with so many lessons for you and what is going to be full of some great advice that you can take away from this one. In this conversation, we cover a whole host of great topics, from why a people function is actually one of the most important functions a consultancy has, to how Stu used fractional leadership to help him build the board that he couldn't afford. We also talk about the full-on journey that was being bought and then buying a new consultancy and what he learned from both sides of that deal table. Whether you are looking for ways to scale your consultancy, or maybe you are somewhere on that PE journey and want to learn about what's coming next, this conversation is packed with so much great advice for you and for anyone looking to scale their consulting firm. And so with that intro done, all that's left to say is please enjoy today's conversation with Stu Packham. Stu, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Nick.
It's great to sit down. And as we were talking about just before this, crazy to think how time has flown since we were first working together.
Which is, I mean, now thinking about it, not only is it's 5 years, but an awful lot has happened in 5 years. An awful lot, both in the world and in their own lives, I think.
Oh, definitely. Well, it's funny. I was saying this to someone the other day, I get the numbers wrong, but in the short time we've been in business, we've had global pandemic, I think 3 or 4 prime ministers, 2 or 3 chancellors, a couple of recessions.
I mean, that's when you put it into that context, it's a lot. But I also think in the same time, it's quite a short space of time. And so quite, but really nice to actually see you in real life again.
Likewise, Stu. And I think so much to talk about because I know that you and Alchemist have been on a phenomenal journey over that time. And as I mentioned to you before we started, I love to speak to people who for the show are firsts. And I think you are a first for the show. And I will talk more about that in a moment. But so that our listeners can place you. Just for those who may not know you, may not know Alchemist, could you share a bit of your background on who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Of course, absolutely. And I think we'll get a bit more into who Alchemist are, I'm sure, as we talk for the next hour or so. But so my background, I've been in and around the talent industry for longer than I care to admit. So 25 years. Spent the majority of that between Australia and the UK, and 20 of my 25 years in and around larger corporate businesses. So started out life in recruitment, very much as an individual contributor, then moved up to run teams, and then from running teams to running divisions. I think at that point in my life, I was very much about how do I climb the corporate ladder? And I worked for one big global recruitment business for 15 years. Then I made the move from a UK-owned business to a US-owned business, broadened out into running an executive search business, a talent management practice, and a country and region. So very much about, once again, taking that next step on the corporate ladder. And then, as you will sort of discover through the next hour, had a complete about face, abandoned the corporate world, and decided I would go into a fast-growing, smaller business. So, but thematically, all in talent.
Well, I think a really succinct intro, Stu, and I love the cliffhanger there. As you will find out over the next hour, I had it's the hero's journey.
I know,
it's
not quite.
You had your call to adventure.
Yeah. Well, but it very much was, and I'm sure lots of people experience this. But it's that whole piece of you set out on a career journey that you think is quite linear, which is I'm quite good at this as an individual contributor. Actually, I quite like running teams. Actually, if I can run teams, I can run an entire division, and I can work my way up. But actually, it's that moment you realise maybe that isn't for you after 20 years.
Yeah.
That's actually quite a big shock to the system.
Well, why don't we start there? Because I wanted to start with how you came to join Alchemist and almost the journey, because as I mentioned, in my teaser, you are the first that I can recall for the podcast CEO who has come in post-deal. Yeah. So I've had people on this show who have sold and exited, and I've also had people who have sold and grown. I've had people who've done an MBO. I don't think I've had anybody who has been landed into a consultancy, PE-backed, and scaled it and grown. And I think to your point, and I'm fascinated because the other thing is there are not many people who cross the divide of search and consulting. And so you were talking about you had this kind of, I've been in search for 20 years. What made you decide now's the time to change? How did you decide consulting? And when this role was put to you, what made you go, yeah, this is the one for me?
Great set of questions. So I think there was quite a linear link thematically between moving where I ended up my life in corporate and moving into the industry I'm now in, which is learning consultancy. So ended up running a talent management business, which was much more around actually engaging strategically with our customers, understanding people, understanding the organization, and then putting solutions together rather than searching for an individual. And I really enjoyed that. So there was a really consistent link. I think how did I know that it was time to make that move is when you imagine yourself, can I still see myself doing this in 20 years' time? And I couldn't. So I knew I wanted to stay in and around the world I understood and loved, but I wanted to probably do it differently. And I wanted to broaden out my scope of understanding of how an organization works. So that kind of led me down the path of I need to do something different. I mean, there isn't a lot of science to actually how I ended up at what was Interact, and you'll hear me mention sort of two earlier names before we became Alchemist. So a company called Interact, which is the business I joined in 2019 as the CEO, and a business called Apex, which was acquired by Interact about 4 weeks after I joined. So I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I think fundamentally I was approached by somebody I knew in the executive search space who'd been given a mandate by Rockpool, who were the incumbent private equity house of Interact, and they were on the search for a CEO. And a friend of mine who ran a search business, who actually you and I both know, phoned me up one afternoon and said, I'm really struggling with a brief. Could you have a look at it for me and tell me if you think I'm asking the right questions and if you know anyone? So sent me the job description over. I read it and thought, actually, I could do that job. So lo and behold, what happened was we put me forward, and after I was the third shortlist, I think.
As in the third person on, or the third time
the third attempt to deliver a shortlist. It wasn't the easiest brief in the world,
What wasn't, and if this derails you, do it
No,
after.
no, it's
But
fine.
why wasn't it easiest?
I think the expectations of what you'd get in one person was quite high, and the realities of finding someone to come run what was a relatively small business in a fairly niche market that brought together a combination of, I guess, commercial skills, sales skills, as well as the ability to build a team who had, ideally, they wanted somebody who had prior experience in growing and scaling a business. But I made that coming out of corporate was not something they thought of. So it had been, I think they'd really struggled to find the right blend. And fortunately or unfortunately for them, I ended up being the person that was selected for it. But it wasn't an overly scientific, I'm going to target that organization. It was, sometimes these things are serendipitous, I think.
Yeah, well, and like you say, it's amazing how many of those stories are. To your point, and if we can't share these, stop me, but
Of course.
revenue when you joined Interact, how big was Interact?
So Interact, when I joined, was about 2 million in revenue, maybe a little bit less, and a relatively small EBITDA profit margin. I mean, I think if now's the right time for me to tell the story about why I was brought in then I'm happy to share that.
I would love to go there, just so that we can, to your kind of hero's journey earlier. Spoiler alert to the end. Where are you revenue wise now, if you can share?
So as a group, Alchemist is just short of 20 million revenue now.
Wow. So 10 times in about 5. We'll stick with 5 years because it makes
5 years makes the whole thing much easier.
Yeah, 10 times 5 years, Stu. That's going to be the title of the episode. So yeah, I think it would be great to hear about that because I'm thinking about, and just to help you, like you say, you've come from corporate. If I think in the consulting world, there is a kind of a graveyard of people who have tried to go from big consultancy to little, and almost the advice that most people give is it never works because you've got someone coming in who's used to having bag carriers, structures. You're landing from a different industry, but the places you work were big corporate search firms into a smaller end boutique.
Yep.
Yeah. Pick us up there, Steve.
Yeah, okay. So and I think there's a lot of levels to that. But I think the most important thing was probably the shock to the system.
For you or for the business?
For me, and probably for the business, but certainly the shock to the system for me of day one. So you go through an interview process. So I was interviewed by the investment house. So I didn't meet the organisation, couldn't meet the organisation because I was being brought in to replace an incumbent. So it was quite a sensitive situation.
At the request of the investment house.
At the request of the private equity house. And so I went through a fairly intense process over about 90 days with the investor, including an entire day with a psychologist, several meetings with partners, meetings with the chairman, none of which I'd done before. But you form a picture. So you form a picture of what am I getting into? What's the brief? I made a decision that I'd be really honest about what I was and what I wasn't, because I didn't want to set them or me up to fail. So I was pretty transparent around my skills, capabilities, but also probably by this point in my life, it was very much probably my blind spots. And then I think it was day one, I walked through the door, having left an organization I was running of 70 or 80 people, to discover I had 6 employees in Southwark.
So you didn't know that?
I didn't.
Did you know the business?
I knew the business. I knew who the business was. I knew what the business did. I obviously couldn't do any real research because as soon as you start fishing around on LinkedIn, people work out pretty quickly something's going on. So I knew ostensibly what the financial performance was. I knew what the objectives were, but I'd never met any of the employees. So I'd met the chair and that was it. And I walked through the door on day one in Southwark Bridge Road and gave a lovely greeting. They had only found out the day before I was coming.
So the day before the previous CEO had been exited.
Yeah, and I was then joining the day after.
Wow.
So it was a pretty intense situation to walk into. So met our chair at the time for a coffee in London at 7:30 in the morning. We walked in together and it was like, wow, this is my new life. And so very quickly probably day one, I went home having met some amazing people, all bar one of which are still with me. So, and I think that's quite important and we'll come back to that later on. So that team, some of whom had been in that business for 20 years, had been through a hell of a journey themselves, having been a privately owned business for 25 years under a founder. Founder had sold the business, exited day one, So one of the things I now know for if I ever needed to look for a job in the future is a completely different secondary set of questions I'd ask if I was being interviewed by a private equity house.
I love that, Stu. Well, and that then creates the fascinating question, and take this as it works for the story, but a lot of CEOs come in with a 100-day plan. Yep. So you've come in, and again, I will kind of use at time fairly extreme language to make it dramatic but clear, is like, the investment house has a short time frame. Like, they've just exited your predecessor. I'm sure your conversations with them was like, fix this or you're not going to last too long. And you've just come from a place where you're running with 80 people and you've got the corporate functions, presumably. What did you do, Stu?
Yeah.
How did you, and I guess, how did you get to grips with team, clients, actually the business model of the business, and then diagnose the problems to get out of that phase?
Yeah. Okay. So probably if I go back a step to go forward a step. So as part of the interview process, I had to prepare a 100-day plan for the investor. And I prepared a 100-day plan for the investor based upon, I think, a brochure and a financial document they gave me. But fundamentally, preparing a 100-day plan is preparing a 100-day plan. So it had some bits about strategy, some bits about customers, some bits about revenue growth, and some bits about people. And then fundamentally a bit of a timeline around what would you do when. If I think about the reality of what unfolded, pretty much all of those things happened, not really in the order I thought they would based upon the 100-day plan, and probably not to the extent I thought they would either. So, and I'll explain that for you. So I think the reality of walking into a business that had suffered from a people perspective in terms of culture, coming out of being privately owned to private equity owned, had actually had quite a significant damage on the organization. And it's a lovely business. And the thing that probably got me through that first 100 days is the fact that it was a really, really good group of people. And so what I spent the first 2 weeks doing really was just making sure that the key people that were left in the organization stayed. And because it was a bit of a shock. And actually all it needed was the opportunity for people to sit and talk, to be heard, for me to really understand what had happened. And then when you've only got 6 people, it is relatively easy to be quite inclusive and to help give all of them the opportunity to have their say on what didn't work, what worked. So we rapidly went into, let's have a think about how we get ourselves out of a mess here, shall we? We were on a declining revenue number. The business was really built upon long-term relationships that kept repeating. And we were good at it. So there was a certain percentage of the business that you knew was quite safe. It just hadn't grown. And when you are private equity backed, there is only one thing that really is important, which is growth and value driver. So the key bit here was, how do I make sure that people feel safe? How do I make sure that people know that the future is going to be okay? What have I actually inherited here and what we're going to do about it? So I very quickly in week 1, in fact, day 2, went out and saw a live delivery to our biggest customer. So it happened we had one running. So I decided to go up to Milton Keynes and see that in real life, which actually was probably the best thing I could have done. Because reading about it on paper and listening to what people told me was one thing. Actually going and watching what we did was amazing and gave me the absolute confidence that if we got the plan right, we had something special. Hence the reason the investors had bought it in the first place, but hadn't really managed to identify what they were going to do with it. And that's not really their job. But I think it was, okay, let's apply some basics here. Who have I got? What are they good at? And how do I use that? That was my core sort of first thing. Second bit was I had a 1 day a week finance director who happens to now be Alchemist Group CFO.
You inherited that finance director?
So okay. She was there when I joined. She was doing 1 or even a half day a week. What I'd realised coming out of corporate, that whilst I'd owned a P&L, I hadn't really owned a P&L. I'd owned a sheet with some revenue numbers on it and then some costs I was told about. And I'd never really worried about cash. Never really thought about it in my entire career. So suddenly I'm running this business where I am accountable for all of it. So I also, alongside getting to know the business, getting to know the people, getting to know the customers, spent a reasonable amount of time understanding the mechanics of the P&L and understanding what was our actual financial state. And if anyone wants a quick, a little tidbit that I wish I'd known at the time was ask in the interview how much cash is in the bank. So
are you able to share how much was in
I can't remember exactly. It wasn't a huge amount.
Yeah.
It wasn't a huge amount. So I'd gone in, and I think a lot of people do this, and I see it a lot actually in my job now when I'm looking at other businesses, think that by nature investment means you're going to inherit a bucket of cash It doesn't. So fundamentally, there is a big difference between someone giving you venture money and private equity acquiring the shares in an organization. And so we didn't have a lot of cash to play with. So it almost became how are we going to trade our way out of this? So that was very much my sort of Interact experience. And then there's one other piece just to throw into the mix here for you. And I know this is the world's longest answer.
Okay, Stu, this is all of the detail I was going to ask anyway, so keep going.
But I think there's another piece in this, which is 4 weeks into that journey of me joining Interact as CEO, we completed on the acquisition of a second learning business called Apex up in Scotland. And that had obviously been in the pipeline. I was aware it was in the pipeline, but that landed 4 weeks after I joined. So alongside me trying to get my head around Interact and what we're going to do about driving Interact forward, then suddenly another learning business that is our sister company now turns up on the horizon. So that added an extra level of complexity around, okay, so what's this journey going to look like?
And I assume that was in your 100-day plan then, if you knew it was coming?
No.
Okay.
So for full transparency, the structure at that point in time was I would run Interact as CEO. The incumbent founder of Apex sold the business but stayed with the business as CEO. And then we would both report to a newly created board. So it was a chair and 2 CEOs running side by side with the sort of purpose at that point of being we would be the first 2 acquisitions in what the plan was to grow a learning group.
And so we will probably come back to that because I understand from our previous chats and the spoiler for people, actually the journey was more organic than inorganic, which we'll come back to. I think just to hold on your 100-day plan then, because you said, I think what I heard was pretty much everything you had in 100-day plan happened, just not in the right order or not in the same order. So I caught, actually hearing the team, letting them be heard, making sure that they felt part of that journey, going to see that real life delivery. Do you remember any of those other kind of top level things that were like, these were the things that meant that 100 days was successful?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm being honest, the most important thing in making that first 100 days successful was giving the people in the organization, there were 2 customer facing people, a couple of project managers and a finance team. So it wasn't that complicated. Had I not been able to integrate myself with them pretty quickly and give them some confidence there was a future, because they were their world was falling down around them, I don't think any of the 100-day plan would have happened. And I, without jumping to the end of the story, and we'll get to it again, I'm sure later on in the conversation, having just done a much more significant acquisition with 2 geographical locations that are about as far from where I live as possible, the reality is you still have to go people first. So in any 100-day plan, you can build a complex integration strategy. You can start to look for synergies, but actually if you don't get the people bit right, none of it will work because no one will listen, and actually you create risk everywhere. I think the other bit was, let's just focus on making sure in that first 100 days, the investor is 100% aligned with us on what the actual performance of this business is. There had been probably some mismanagement for a whole range of reasons on expectation. So what they were expecting to see never materialized. And whenever you create a gap in expectation, it causes you over time a significant problem. Once that belief disappears, you can't redo it, you're hamstrung. So we needed to quite quickly work out what's our bottom, what's our floor here, and what's reality and how we're going to trade our way out of it, but also be realistic around what trading out of it meant. So we did that in the first 100 days, and that bought me the time and the credibility to be able to then put a bigger plan in place.
If you are currently searching for even more to help you improve your consultancy, then I have something for you that is going to improve your consultancy's marketing. If you go to createengage.co.uk/insights, you can find our super detailed, super practical ebook that will let you build an effective marketing strategy for your consultancy, giving you the tools you need to outpace your competitors and deliver that all-important ROI from your marketing. createengage.co.uk/insights, and I look forward to hearing what you think of the ebook. You mentioned, obviously, you came in as 2 businesses and you talked about the distinction of Interact and Alchemist. And I really want to get onto the growth journey that came from that 100 plans, because as my listeners know, I love detail, but I'm sure for some, they probably want past 100 days as well. And I wonder if maybe that next jumping off point is the rebrand to Alchemist, because obviously in between that, during that, there was COVID. Our work together, I think, was at the start of COVID. And obviously, the rebrand has sort of taken you on to that next phase. I'd love to pick that up because I think it then introduces the organic growth quite well. Like, talk me through the rationale and the decision to rebrand. And I know when we spoke, you highlighted that kind of rebranding was a real catalyst for growth. So I'd love to know why, because so many consultancies rebrand in the hope of growth, but it doesn't deliver growth. So how you actually made it additive would be fascinating.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And so if I can just go, I know we're a long way past COVID now, so almost talking about the pandemic feels like yesterday's news, but I think it actually, in a business context, acted as quite a significant accelerator that led to the decision to rebrand. So I'm going to give a very quick go back.
Yeah, go for it.
So going into the pandemic period, so what was that, March 2020?
Yep.
God, that does feel like a long time ago. March 2020. If you picture Interact, new CEO, probably 80 days into a 90-day plan, second acquisition, Apex, new into an investment house, been together broadly for 2 months, pandemic hits. And these are two distinct, relatively small learning consultancies who are 90% reliant on revenue from face-to-face learning delivery. So quite a significant problem quite quickly. And I think that's when I was talking to you.
Yeah.
So what it did is tactically forced a whole load of decisions that we had to make, which was around, like a lot of businesses were doing at the time, which is, do we essentially wrap this up in cotton wool and use the furlough scheme? Or do we use this as a platform to rethink what we would have had to do anyway, which is, what does our integrated business look like? And how do we take this group to market? We chose the second. Unfortunately for me and everyone else, we did that. So I think during the COVID or pandemic period, it meant that Interact and Apex by nature were finding ways of working together. And the two businesses, so the sales teams and the studio in Apex and the delivery capability that Interact had around experiential learning, we started to work out that actually if you took bits of both, put them together, you could create a whole new solution. And we'd inherited through the second acquisition some underlying technology that we owned the IP for. It was quite ahead of its time. And what it meant was that we could digitally platform our learning. So we were learning lots of new things quite quickly. We were experimenting massively with our customers who were quite open to it because they had no choice. But what that did was actually made us realize that trying to run two distinct heritage businesses side by side, trying to work out how we play together without confusing the customer and without confusing the employees was a waste of time. And actually the best thing to do at that point, as we started to come out the back end of the pandemic, was we need to go whole hog here and we need to completely integrate the two businesses. So lock, stock and two smoking barrels, for want of a better phrase. And as part of that, we almost need to give ourselves a new lease of life. So the rebrand was actually two things. It was about giving a label to a whole new entity, but also about creating something new, because you had a group of people who'd spent most of their career in Interact, group of people that spent most of their career in Apex. And actually what it meant we could do was they could hold on to that heritage, but actually doing it under a new banner made everyone feel like it was a fresh start. So that was, for us, we made that decision. We were expecting quite a lot of, I can't believe we're going to do this. And we got zero pushback from customers and zero pushback from employees. And actually what it did is it then meant we could follow a process, which was a marketing-led process of physically creating a brand of what did we want our identity to be. But much more than that, how do you get a group of people to align behind something new? And how do you create something that you know your customer wants? So we went through an entire top to bottom exercise. And I think the rebrand really was the culmination of 12 months worth of work to do a complete overhaul of what does this combined entity look like? And then to your point, how do we make sure we come out of this and grow? Because otherwise you can spend a year pontificating, coming up with a lovely new brand with loads of new colors and loads of new imagery and loads of new big statements. But if you don't organize the business properly to come in behind it and you don't engage your customers on the journey, you're not going to grow. So it was quite pivotal.
It sounds it, Stu, and I guess there's a kind of you mentioned there the year before, and also how do you align the business after? Well, firstly, how much did you restructure the business? And it leads on to a question. But yeah, how big are you mentioned kind of bringing them together, lock, stock, two smoking barrels. So was it full rethinking about the different teams, the different parts of the business, what you needed? Was it completely top to bottom?
Yeah. So look, I wasn't reorganizing General Electric. We were reorganizing two small learning companies. But actually, it was quite an interesting experiment of how can you design a business that you're trying to scale without the ability to pump hundreds of heads into it. So actually, it was really simple. Is who do we want to face off to the customer? So who are the right people we already have in the organization to face off to the customer and be helping the customer understand what we do? And then what support do we need to put behind them? And then how do we start to create some shared services so that the people that are facing off to the customer aren't doing everything else too? Because historically, certainly in both organizations, you found there was quite a lot of reliance on a few key people to sell, to do the thinking, to do the building, and sometimes the delivery. So I needed to take that apart and start to create, how do we focus our time and effort on the customer? So realistically, it went to a sales organization. We knew we needed to invest. We'd never invested any money in marketing. So we knew we needed to do that. I went really early with creating a people function. And I'm sure we'll talk about this too, but I was quite adamant. It's not your classic early PE hire. So in a lot of organizations, I was absolutely determined that if we were going to build a business I could scale, I needed to get that function in really early. And I'm really glad I did. So we did that. And then it was creating things like, how do we create a shared service of our studio up in Scotland, who had huge capability? How do we make that accessible to everyone that needs it? So it was some basic organization design and then getting everyone to align behind a bit of a, now we're going to go and do this.
I do want to come on to the people function. I realise, though, and there will be no other time for me to ask this because I should have asked it earlier. It touched a bit on, we talked about, obviously, that kind of interview process, the change. I'm not going to ask you, but I would love to, what the psychologist told you after, after an hour. And have you ever seen, is it Billions, where they have the kind of psychologist person? I'd love to know, Stu, what a day with Stu told you about yourself, but don't have to share that here.
Well, if you want me to, I'm quite happy to. Because it's quite simple. And one thing this whole process of helping to scale a business has done to me is made me very self-aware. And I was relatively self-aware before, but I think living in a corporate world, you often hide that self-awareness. It was very simple, and it actually mirrored exactly how I felt about myself, which was, if you want somebody that can bring some energy, drive, creativity, and the ability to bring a collection of disparate people together, I was quite good for that. And I understood customers and some basic things too. If you want somebody who is also going to fully execute on every single one of those line items, I'm not your person. And I knew that. So the feedback from the psychologist was, if you just leave Stu on his own, you'll have a ton of great ideas and a load of quite motivated people. You may not deliver what you need to deliver. So make sure you wrap an operating structure around him.
Yeah.
And that was quite important.
Well, and that kind of teases into my next question and actually answers a little bit, because, and your self-awareness, I think, is interesting in this. So, again, and this is cliched, and it's not to offend any recruiters that I know. It is, though, it's a different business model.
Yeah.
And typically I've never worked in recruitment, but recruitment is such a sales-focused business. Most recruiters, and even recruiters I know who have moved into the consulting space, tend to lead with a similar mindset of, it's got to be a great service, but let's go sales-led. And again, cliche, but typically recruitment is you sell or you're out. The people stuff is, the softer stuff is, it's coming in, but is not traditionally in the space. And so I'm fascinated to this, the way you describe it. And you say, oh, we're just merging two little businesses. That's really easy. But you're merging businesses in a space you don't know, doing something different. And I guess it's, how did you fill those gaps, to your self-awareness point, to be able to restructure that business? And then I do want to come on to why the people function. Because again, if we'd never met Stu, I would have said, you're going to stuff it full of salespeople, give everyone bonus targets, and that's how you'll grow. Why wasn't that how you grew it?
So I think there was an element of that. So if you talk to, and it's a strong theory you hear quite a lot from investors, which is surely you just need more salespeople. It's come up in virtually every.
It's that and price, isn't it? That's the PE playbook.
Put the price up and have more people to sell it. And there was an element of that. So part of how we've scaled over the last couple of years is we have had to put more people into the commercial function, and we have had to become much more commercially minded. So that, don't get me wrong, it's not all been sit around a campfire and hope that you accelerate a business 10x. So there is a strong balance here, but you can only do that once you've got the foundations in. And so part of this for me was around, there are a group of super talented people in these organizations I've inherited who've only ever worked for really small businesses. So actually, it's how do we start to implement some of the thinking around what makes a great business, and how do we make sure we put some structure in to help them do that? Because I guess I had two choices. Do I create the best business I can possibly create and give the existing people the opportunity to step into that? Or do I just go out and hire a search firm and hire 5 or 6 really senior people and hope they can come in and do it? My strong preference even today is I will always go to the internal people first and give them the opportunity as long as I'm confident I can wrap the support around them. So if you think then about how we rebuilt what is now Alchemist from 2 organizations, we had to go right the back to basics, which is we had to create a purpose. So, and we brought in an organization, an individual to help us do that. We had to make sure that everybody in the organization had a chance to contribute to a shared value set, because both organizations had different values. So we did that and built that from the ground up again. So everyone had a chance to connect. And what that then starts to do is people have a common language. We were nowhere near at that point. And even today, we're still not 100% towards one way of working, but I'm kind of okay with that, because as long as everyone can talk and collaborate using a common language, that works quite well. But I think fundamentally it came back to, I can't do that by myself. Whilst I knew it's what we needed to do, I needed to get somebody in, ideally I trusted. So I started off with and we'll talk about fractional leadership in a bit more detail. I knew I needed some help and some thinking from bigger organization thinking how we apply it, of how do we build a culture? How do we build a collective culture? But how do we make sure from the early days it's clear that has to be a performance culture? It's that delicate balance between having an investor, and my job as CEO, whether it was back in 5 years ago or today, is to make sure that investor relationship works, who, let's be honest, just want growth. They don't really care how you do it. They just want growth. Balanced off with, I want to run an organization that people really want to work for. And I want to make it a place where people can come to work and be themselves. And I want to make it somewhere that they want to get their friends to come and work. How do I get those two worlds to collide? And I knew we had to get the culture right. And if we didn't, that was going to be impossible. Because otherwise we'd do exactly what you said, which is stuff it full of salespeople. And I've seen more recruitment businesses than you can possibly imagine go from 10 people to 100 people, back to 8 people, up to 20 people, because very few get it right, because you're always chasing a number.
Well, and talk to me about, let's use the people function and then that broader fractional approach, because we talked about it ahead of this. It feels quite unorthodox, and I love unorthodox, Stu. So let's start with why the people function and what that actually did for you, and then we can go into kind of what other fractional support you had from there.
So I think 2 things. People function for me is not an HR function. So there is always in any business, HR ops, HR admin, all the basics, making sure contracts exist. Of course, we had to do that. It was much more around how do we put people at the middle of our strategy. So I needed somebody that was much more on the strategic end of people and culture than on the operating end. And I knew if I got that right and I got the right person, they would basically be by my side as we tried to do this. Because people didn't really previously have that much clarity on what is my job? How am I measured? How am I rewarded? How do I get promoted? So what's the organizational structure? And so things like that. And look, we're still traveling that journey now because we're growing so quickly. But I think the reality was we had to get that in early. And that allowed everybody then to come in and around that, so that when we then went to the next phase of growth, it made sense to do it. So it's kind of almost laying the architecture early so that we could get in and make sure that we knew where we were going with it.
And I mean, with hindsight, Stu, it makes perfect sense. I guess probably quite a big call. And I don't know where you were financially at this point, but let's assume you were doing better. But to your point, you're trading out, and you're trading out of, the challenge. So cash is always going to be tight. Did you have to do any convincing of the investor that you're bringing on a X day a week people person? I'm sure it's a meaningful amount of money, obviously divided by the days, but like that's still money, to your point, the investors aren't getting. Did you have to convince them of this?
I think by this point in the journey, I had enough personal equity, and I don't mean financial equity, I had enough personal trust with the board for them to believe that I knew what I was doing. And that as long as I was not being stupid and saying I need to go and recruit the CHRO of Microsoft on a full-time basis, then actually, as long as my business case was solid, they were going to back me on it. But it's always, my entire approach to this has been start small. So actually prove your thesis by finding the right person, being really clear on what you want to try and achieve, and then introduce them in small doses. So actually the financial impact of having somebody working for us for a day a week in the round wasn't huge, but it was quite easy to measure the impact of it. So actually, and then that day became 2 days as we got a bit bigger. And what you're doing bit by bit is you're starting to build that credibility. And okay, so we understand why that person's important to you. And if you come back to that thing around what did the psychologist tell me around what are you going to get from Stu and what are you not going to get from Stu as a leader, I'm not a completer finisher and I never will be. And I'm not afraid to admit that. So actually having people around me that were, so that if I say I want to be a people first strategy, somebody's going to make sure that we actually do it. And that's why I was able to convince the investor relatively easily that we should do that.
And this is a really practical one. And I'm sure listeners will be wondering this. The approach sounds like it made perfect sense and worked. There's an obvious question. How did you scope, and this is really in the weeds, but I think it's important. Like, how did you scope what could be done in that day? Because, if I'm hiring a head of people for a year, they can do these things. Okay, if I divide that by 5, well, the year's strategy is now going to take me half a decade. And, I'm going to see it done in weekly interval sprints. Like, how did you approach that, I guess, conversation, planning, structuring with your, head of people to be able to deliver at the speed a PE fund will need? Yeah. And also, to your point of not being a completer finisher, I suspect then within that, you're not always the best at, you're not always going to be on someone's back about a plan
and holding account.
So how did you make sure you had a plan? And then 6 months in, you're not miles away from it.
I think the most important bit was agreeing up front, what do we want to achieve to enable the strategy? So actually we know we want to be at the end of the year. What are the critical anchors that we've got to do between now and then? What's the most important and where are we going to start? And then allowing that individual to come back to me with here's how I'm going to do it. And actually, that's why, to a degree, using somebody who is used to consulting into you rather than I've been a chief people officer in a big corporate organization was the perfect solution. Because that person was used to going into SMEs and was used to working with somebody like me and actually extracting from me what we needed to do, but also bringing their own knowledge. So it was like, okay, so what's the most obvious thing we need to do first? Oh, we might need some job descriptions because we haven't got any. So, okay, let's focus on doing that first and let's get around the organization. Embedding our values. How are we going to embed our values? Okay, I'll take that as a project. And whilst we were under pressure to grow, by this point, we were organically coming out of COVID and the numbers were getting better. So we were selling bigger deals. Actually, some normality was coming back into the P&L. So I got a little bit of breathing space because I think we all went, okay, we're going to be okay here. Which meant I had a window of opportunity where everyone, well, the business has survived and actually it's growing. So well done. And now what we're going to do with it. So it gave us a bit of space to do that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That kind of project basis. And interesting what you said. You specifically chose someone who had consulted in this space, not someone who had retired as a grand CPO and said, well, now I'm fractional.
Yeah.
Why are those I mean, you touched on some of it, but why is that different? Because I see so many people who do that latter. I've been a big CMO at somewhere, a CPO, etc. Now I'm fractional. Why doesn't that route work for you, or didn't you find it work as well?
So having come out of big corporate myself, and look, for full disclosure, the person that came in to support me through a consulting firm had actually worked with me in the past. They had been an interim HR business partner for me in a previous organization. I had very clear ideas of what a people person looked like and acted like. That person is now our group chief people officer, by the way. So she has been on the whole journey with us from half a day to a day a week to now leading the people function for us across the group. But I think for me, that whole piece around understanding how an SME operates, understanding what it means when you don't have an army of people to do stuff for you, understanding the fact that actually $2,000, quite a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, was quite important. And I think I completely understand there is a big space for people who have been senior executives in people or finance or whatever functions in the corporate world going to maybe the next layer down of business and showing them what amazing looks like. So, and there's lots of famous people, the people that are making careers for now, just talking about that on the lecture circuit. But I think there is for me, translating what enterprise people looks like down to we've got 20 people and we haven't got huge amounts of money. I needed somebody that understood consulting into SME. It was critical. And that really helped us actually get some stuff done. But also what it did is it allowed us to play back to the organization. We promised you that we would take this seriously, and we did.
No, I think, and the way you explain it, Stu, makes perfect sense. And I guess to our conversation earlier around the big four partners who don't work in a small firm, if you've come from 10, 20,000 to 20 people, that shift can be really hard. And I guess then to bring this and make it practical for anyone listening who's like, this sounds like a great approach. I know you built almost your whole exco or your sort of leadership team on this fractional basis. How could someone, or how did you build that? And I guess also, how did you then grow that over time? Because I love what you said around, test your thesis, and then 1 becomes 2 days, 2 becomes 3.
Okay, so, and if it helps, just to explain, so my head of people was fractional, my finance director was fractional, and then the person that supported us on strategy through to exit for 2 years was fractional. So actually, you're right, essentially my top team, apart from me, were kind of all fractionals who started off probably on a day a week. And I think there was 2, if I explain why I did it and then how it played out, because it did cause concern with the investor and the chair, but only for the reason that on an exit, how on earth are we going to explain that essentially 3 of our corporate functions are run by fractional consultants who could leave tomorrow? And so I was adamant that I was going to do it that way. I wasn't 100% adamant at the time that it would be that way at exit, but I'll kind of take you through how it played out. So I think first and foremost, I knew I needed capability I couldn't afford on a full-time basis. It was quite simple. I knew what skills I needed, what capabilities I needed, what experience I needed. And I could never justify having them as FTEs on 5 days a week. And secondly, I'm not so sure the people coming at that level with that level of experience would have wanted to come to us at that point as an FTE anyway, because the jobs were not formed. It wasn't right, we've scoped all this out and we need that, that, and that. I needed people that could come in and help me either demonstrate we needed it or not. I think the CFO role, as is now, or the FD role at the time, was a no-brainer. As the business got bigger, it put more burden on the finance team. Being private equity owned, whether you are 2 million or 200 million, puts inordinate reporting strain on an organization. So one of the things that I quite like about being private equity owned, which is a massive shock to people on day one, which is your reporting burden is phenomenal. Your finance function needs to be absolutely watertight. And the only job apart from the CEO that the investor will ever get involved in hiring is the CFO. So they will have a strong hand in making sure that you have a CFO that they trust so that they can go to and can give them what they need. So building that capability through fractional meant I could have a much more experienced CFO. We had a great finance team that had helped sort of both brands grow, but they, by their own admission, didn't particularly understand that investor relations part. So that was part of that. We've talked about people. And then the third one, which I think is actually one of the main drivers for how we got from 20 people to 60 people, from 2 million to 10 million, and then beyond, was actually we needed somebody to bring in some strategic thinking to help with I'm trying to run a business that's moving quite fast. But actually what we didn't really have, when I'm not by nature a planner, was somebody to come into the organization and say, okay, I'm going to help you focus on what your ambition really is and translate the goals and value drivers to actually an ambition that everyone in the organization can understand. We're going to do some work around that, how that ambition translates to a strategy for 3 years. And then we're going to break that down by year into a plan on a page. And so I brought in an ex-chief strategy officer from another very well-known learning business who happened to be introduced to me at the time. She had scaled a learning consultancy from 4 million to 20 million. She'd exited it to a big 4 consulting firm. And so had a hell of a lot of experience that I didn't have. So really helped me and the SLT build that plan. And bit by bit by bit, I realized actually you've come in and done some very distinct projects for us and helped us then hang how we grow the organization around that plan. So everyone was super clear. Every SLT meeting we had, we'd come back to the plan. Every company update, we'd present the plan and say where we were on it. But having fractional people I could never have afforded that person full time. And I'm not so sure she would have joined us full time either. But then as we started to head towards exit, that skill set became incredibly valuable.
Stu, you're a master of your craft. Why?
So,
put us out of our misery.
I think there's 2 things. So there is an art of strategy, I think, and you'll know this better than me, I think.
Well, and I was going to ask what you mean. What does strategy mean in your context? Because everyone, it's a word people use, and I'm not saying this is you, but it gets used in a lot of contexts.
So to me, the strategic plan was, what are the value driver areas that we need to make sure that we are investing in, both from an operating perspective to enable us to enable the plan that the investor wants us to achieve. So it was how do we translate into 4 or 5 key strategic pillars, how we get there into action, and then how does the plan support that? So, and that can be, for example, like one of our strategic pillars was, how do we make sure our value proposition is very clear? And are we aligned? Is everyone aligned behind the value proposition? We had a people pillar. But I think what started to happen, so we did that for year 1, and that really helped us grow. Then just as we were going in, we then did the year 2 exercise and the refresh. And then before you knew it, we were in a sale process. We'd been approached off market, and we were suddenly having to talk to a new group of investors about the direction of this business. That skill set about...
so it wasn't Rockpool's intention to sell at that point?
No, sorry, I'd have probably just dropped that in as a hand grenade. No, so we were not on the market. We were not at the end of our cycle. We probably had 14 months. So if I think about what the timelines were, this was November 23 when we were approached. We were not even thinking about talking to advisors till summer 24 at the earliest. The board believed we had another year of the cycle to run. But when we were approached, it kind of caught everyone off guard because it was a really serious approach. And it was a bit like buses, because approach 1 was followed 2 days later by approach 2.
So when you say as in 2 separate organizations?
2 separate private equity organizations.
Why did they approach you?
2 reasons. Number 1, it's a big world that we live in, but quite a small world at the same time. So quite often what you'll find is there will be a CEO of a private equity backed vehicle company who will talk to their private equity house and say, I happen to know of a business who are doing this that I think we should approach. And that's how both of those originated. So it wasn't they'd done a big piece of research and our name came up on a list. It was somebody actually in America and somebody in the UK on 2 separate instances went, I think you should go and try and talk to Alchemist. So that's where that came from. But we weren't ready. We were not ready. So, and I know some of what this is about how do you guide a business through a process like this? We were probably 6 months off in readiness for what it was going to take us to exit the business, which meant that the fractional skill sets I had suddenly went straight back to the top and went, okay, now you're going from doing 2 days a week, you're all now 5 days a week. And we are going to put every effort we can behind making sure we are ready for exit.
If you are enjoying this episode, if you've got anything from this episode, my question to you is, why keep it to yourself? The whole reason I started this podcast was to share knowledge from guests like this with you. And I would like to ask you to do the same. Please, if you are enjoying this episode, take a moment and hit share and send it to a friend, send it to a colleague, send it to a client, send it to anyone that you think will benefit from it, because you've benefited from it. And the way we make our industry better is by sharing and helping each other. I hope that you and your friend enjoy talking about this episode, enjoy sharing the learnings, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's conversation. And I appreciate the answer to this might be that the economics change when you're getting to an exit, so that you're not looking at cash flow, you're looking at kind of enterprise value, so how much the business is worth at the end. But there's just an obvious question in there of the logic makes sense. I could pay someone £100,000 for a salary, or I could pay you £1,000 a day, and that is less, but it's half my costs. Suddenly you're getting all these people to 5 days. So was that when you started to have FTE conversations, or did you just was suddenly 5xing our consulting spend?
No, I think number one was, by this point, I made the decision. I was really clear with Rockpool that I was going to be very transparent with any buyer, the makeup of that team. And actually, everyone was quite nervous about that. But because we'd worked together by this point for 3 years. So whilst it was not a team made up of FTEs, we were all absolutely in lockstep with each other. So it was very easy for us to turn up to a meeting and look like and we are a high functioning team. So that immediately took the pressure off. So I can remember, first presentation we did to the new investor was us as a senior leadership team in that room. And it was because we knew each other so well, no one would ever have known, but I was pretty transparent about it. But I had, by that point, when I knew this was serious, I absolutely had started guys, we cannot go into the next setup with all of you as interims. It's just not going to work. So, but we were big enough by this point and we knew where we were going that actually the conversation was, if we close this deal, I need you to go full time. And I'd done that. So amazing, which has been really good.
So this process dropped on you. And again, Stu, unorthodox things I love to dig into or kind of unusual things. And I've had guests on here, like you say, private equity firms prepare a business for sale, take time, get it ready, just like you do a house, you get ready for market. So you have this process dropped on you. And I guess I would love to hear, and I'll ask it as learnings and you can frame it as you want, like, actually looking back, if we've got anyone listening thinking, I'd love to go through that process, I'd like to be acquired or coming to a second turn, actually, what was that process like? And from your learnings of that, what is that advice you would give to others?
Yeah. And interestingly, having just been through being on the other side of the fence for the first time and acquiring another business, actually, I shared a lot of this with that firm as we were going through the process. So I think two things. It was nothing like I expected it to be. My chair at the time, who was an amazing support to me all the way through this journey, had said to me, imagine what you think this is going to be like, and it's going to be 10 times worse. And because I had no context, I'd never sold a business.
Why doesn't the dentist say that to
you? But I think there was the reality of, I understand there is a process. So we shortcut the traditional sale process. So the traditional sales process is engage an advisor, prepare your IM, do some fireside chats with investors, see who's interested, then run a management presentation process. We didn't do any of that. So because we were approached off market. However,
a two-horse race.
Two-horse race. But what we decided to do fairly quickly was to go with one. So rather than playing them off against each other.
Why?
There were two things that were super important to me. One was strategic fit. So, and actually, secondly, I wanted to be the platform player in the process. And what that means is, essentially, I wanted to be the core investment business rather than a bolt-on.
Got you. And for our listeners who may not be as au fait with the model, PE tends to have business that acquires others to create the whole, or acquired to be consumed by the whole.
Yes.
You wanted to be platform business, the business that acquires, the Alchemist brand stays.
Yeah, and that was quite important because we'd obviously spent so much time trying to build our own culture, our own DNA, and actually we put a lot of the infrastructure in place. So that was quite important to me. But I think despite the fact we sort of didn't have to go through the rigors of the upfront sale process, it also meant that we hadn't done all of the housekeeping work necessarily to make sure we were in the sort of first stage of, can we provide all of the data? Because, I mean, it's really difficult to describe. And actually, it sounds like, why you're making such a big thing of this. The due diligence process we went into was probably the most challenging 6 months of my career, because we were in pretty good shape. Our CFO essentially had a data room already. She'd done exits before. We were private equity owned already. So we knew what data's cleanliness needed to be in place. The level of pressure due diligence puts a business under is phenomenal, particularly when you're a small business. So it took myself and our CFO out of play for 6 months. So, because there are two streams that I now understand operate in tandem that become quite intense, which is essentially you're going through business due diligence with a potential buyer who wants to get to know you, your team, the business, your customers. And that's not I turn up, give a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation, I go, great, that's what I needed. It is months of getting to know the business, deep conversations. So that's part of it. So that's, I talked to you about the importance of the strategy. We needed to be super clear on what our growth plan was, because if you cannot turn up and be in that first meeting, demonstrate how you could take this business from here to here in a certain period of time, you're dead in the water. So, and it cannot be woolly. It cannot be woolly. So it needed to be super clear. Second part was the technical due diligence. So when you are moving, so we went from Rockpool, who were a brilliant first home for the business, but a relatively small cap private equity firm. We went to the next league up, which was a much bigger private equity firm with much more robust due diligence processes, who are used to, for full disclosure, used to buying businesses much bigger than Alchemist. But we went through the same due diligence process as you would have put a business 5 times our size through. Same providers, same advisors. So actually, it put us under intense pressure. We came through it, and actually we've learned a lot from it. But when you're in it, it's you can't expect to still. I had this wild expectation, and I said to our chair, don't worry, I can run the business and I can do this at the same time. And I realized 2 months in, that was not going to happen. So, and it meant that we hadn't probably done the planning up front around how do I delegate authority, things that are quite important, because we were just locked away for 6 months. I think the other thing I've learned about this that I didn't understand before doing this exit was the importance of having your right sell-side advisor. So I didn't really understand what a sell-side advisor did. I understood that they were there to do your IM and help you. But when you're not doing that, I'm like, why do we need one? Actually, they were amazing.
Why do you need one?
So I can now eloquently explain this. You absolutely need somebody who's going to represent your interest when the going gets tough. Because fundamentally, so you've got the seller and the buyer. At some point in the process, there's going to be some difficult conversations. If you do not have somebody that is representing the seller and who is representing the management team, those conversations can spiral out of control. They are experts at doing it, and they earn every penny. So, because actually what they do is tell you, don't worry, guys, this is quite normal. We've got this. Or actually preparing, you're about to go into this session. You think it's about this, but actually it's about this. So that is that sort of advice. So that sort of advisory work that I was like, okay, I now 100% see why you're there. Now, that's okay if the PE house has that in-house, but most don't.
Fascinating, Stu. I think, and I know our time together is not too long left today. We could do a whole episode. Maybe there is a round 2 on the whole process, because I think, even those nuggets, because I haven't been through this process, but again, what I hear from others, sell-side advisors will take like a estate agent in the house world, a percentage, and obviously, if you're selling a business for a big number, a percentage is a big number.
Is a big number,
and so you actually that question you had, I imagine a lot do. So that value is really, really fascinating to hear. I think the very last question, and it's more the forward-looking, Stu, that will set us up for the round 2. What does this year hold? Because the bit, sadly, we won't get to talk about today, but obviously having just completed the deal with your new partner, you made your first acquisition? You'd started, I think you closed your first acquisition about a month later, was it?
Yeah. So we completed with Horizon Capital in June. 2 weeks later, we went into exclusivity to acquire the Rain Group. So we went into due diligence on the Rain Group 2 weeks after we completed, and we closed the acquisition of Rain in November. So we literally, there was no summer holiday last year, and it was very much the Horizon. The reason I am super excited about Horizon, but also don't slow down very often, is the reality of we are a buy and build platform. We have a very clear thesis on what the opportunity in the market is over the next 5 years, and that is not purely organic. So the challenge for us as an organization now is, how do we maintain our organic growth rate, both in Alchemist and now Rain Group? So how do we maintain consistent growth? And how do we also find accretive opportunity, both at a financial and proposition level, to help us really build a global learning consultancy to tackle, there's a big opportunity in the mid-market. And I think the key for me is to be able to make sure we are super clear on what we can execute on and what we can't. Because there is a challenge you take on too much. So we are 4 months into integration with Rain now. The acquisition, I'm more than happy to, if we get some time in the future, to talk about what's it like to not only just come out of the back of selling a business for the first time as someone who'd never done it, what's it like then to go into being the front person in acquiring somebody else's business and helping them through the process, and what have I learned from that, because that is also quite a lot. But it won't be the last one. So we have now got to make sure that we're into integration. But I said to my team yesterday, we're building a meticulous plan around integrating these two organizations. We've got to think about what happens if something else comes along in 3 months' time.
There is a whole nother podcast in this, Stu. And I guess that last question before I go to my wrap-ups is, so acquisitions on the agenda. What is your 2025 plan? When you sit back at the end of this year, what do you want to have achieved?
I think this year there's two things I could do. We need to just put a bit of stability in the business. There's been a phenomenal amount of change. And it is, Alchemist right now is not an organization you work for if you want to sit still. And that's good and bad. Because every time I think, okay, we're in for a period of 90 days of relative calm, something else happens. So what needs to happen this year? We are in the first full year of ownership of a new owner. We have to deliver our plan. So our investors have investors. We have to make sure we deliver the year one plan. We have got to make sure that we put the right structures in place globally now. So I'm now running a business that's got team in the UK, team in the US, and a team in Australia. So we've got to make sure that globally we've got the right structures in place to be able to effectively run the business, but also then put the next layer on. And I think being super clear on what our next acquisition is. We set out very clearly to be a challenger brand. We are not just trying to emulate the big four. I won't name the others, but there are some massive monolithic learning consultancies who are really good at what they do, but are probably not quite as agile, flexible, or open-minded as we are. I am determined to use our acquisition strategy to keep that challenger brand philosophy running. So Rain was noted by Gartner as being a significant challenger brand in the sales training space. Alchemist have just literally yesterday been named as a business to watch in leadership training globally. So we have got, when it comes to acquisition, I need to buy tomorrow's news, not yesterday's.
We've had a few quotes today, Stu, and I think that is going to be the quote of the episode. This has been fantastic. The last then questions, and these are ones I ask all of my guests. So fascinated for your answers. The first one is about books. And if it's not books, as a learning consultancy, you know the latest resource, Stu, but it's, what is the book or books that have had the biggest impact on you or you've given to the other people the most, and why? So
there is one, we were talking about this the other day. The one book I always try to give somebody, particularly in leadership, is the First 100 Days. There's a book called The First 100 Days. You might need to reference who wrote it because I can never remember.
We will find it. I know. I only know the title of books now with Kindles. I just know the front covers.
Yeah. So it's had a refresh recently. And the reason I send it out to anyone who's either been promoted into a senior leadership role for the first time or is taking on a new business build or whatever it might be. I first inherited it when I was in recruitment and I did leadership. So I was recruiting exec leaders for other businesses and I'd often give them a copy. I now use it internally if somebody because it's not entirely theoretical. It's got some quite good plans in it, got some action stuff. So I always share that book.
Amazing, Stu. And then this is the last of our questions. You have 3 people in front of you. One is just starting their career in consulting, maybe fresh from university. One is 4, 5, 6 years in. And the final one, I phrase it as approaching partner in a bigger firm. It could be approaching, you just mentioned, around approaching a leadership position. And the question is, what one piece of advice would you give to each of them? Okay, so let's start in that order. So the person right at the start of their career, I would be open-minded to try as many different things as you can in a shorter space of time as possible. Don't have a fixed idea of this is what I'm going to do and this is all I'm going to do and I'm going to do it forever. I think the more you can experiment early. So I know a lot of more structured graduate programs now have rotations and things. I think if you're not in a business that gives you that automatic structure, try to get as much exposure as you can to as many things as possible. If I think about
people that joined our business 4 years ago as graduates. I've got a couple, they are still with us. One of them is now running a significant portfolio of customers for us because she was prepared to, she's had 3 different roles in the organization in 4 years and has thrown herself into it and has done a super job. So experiment as much as you can. I think the person with sort of 4 to 5 years experience is start to think about, do I want to be a manager and be responsible for people and potentially a leader in the future? Or do I want to be an individual contributor? I think a lot of people in consultancies, and I'm sure you saw this too, but certainly the world I grew up in, often it was seen that the only path for you was to become a manager, and it's not for everybody. So I think once you become really good at what you do, when you get to that sort of 5 or 6, start and ask people's opinion. Don't be afraid of saying, actually, I just want to follow an expert path. And then I think if I'll probably use myself as an example for the last one. I think if I was sitting in a mid to large size consulting business, which I have done, and I was thinking about, I'm about to get my MD or partner job. Let's be honest, that's a significant commitment and probably sets the destination for the rest of your career. I think my advice would be, A, am I sure this is what I want to do? And secondly, seek out people that can help you understand what your alternatives might be, just to make sure you validate your decision. So I guess my advice would be, don't just go into autopilot and go, yes, please. Think, where do I sign? Use that gate, and that probably at that period where you can see it on the horizon. And interesting, I am talking to quite a lot of people in my network at the moment who have set out like I did to have quite a structured career in consulting and are now at the senior director level and are on a partner pathway and have decided that partner pathway isn't for them. And certainly that move at that point potentially into industry or into an SME consulting firm becomes a real option.
Some great advice, Stu, and thank you. This has been a fantastic conversation. I feel we've gone deep in pockets, but there's so much more we could have scratched the surface on. Thank you for this. I've loved it. The only last question, if someone wants to find out about you, find out about Alchemist, where would you point them to? Where can they get in touch?
So I'd love to hear from you. If you want to talk to me personally or want some personal advice, LinkedIn is kind of my go-to destination. So feel free to contact me on LinkedIn. I think if you want to learn more about Alchemist, learn more about our journey, this is alchemist.com. Got a refresh website this year. There's loads of info on there. And you can also talk to the team through it too. So feel free, and we'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put those in the show notes, Stu, and thank you again. Enjoy, what's left of the week. There isn't much. Have a lovely weekend, and thank you for today.
Thanks, Nick. It's been great to see you again. Really enjoyed it.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Today's episode is brought to you by Create Engage, the specialist digital marketing agency for the disruptive management consultancy. Now, for long-time listeners, you will probably already know who we are. You may have even heard one of our ads on a previous episode of this podcast. But for those of you who don't, here is a short introduction. At Create Engage, we help you create an effective marketing strategy for your consultancy, a strategy that will resonate with your target clients. And then we support you by delivering the campaigns you need to turn that strategy into a reality, helping you to build your brand, raise your profile with your prospective clients, and ultimately generate return on investment from your marketing activity. Now, I could tell you about many of the great clients that we work with and the results we've delivered for them. But instead, I'm going to do something much more powerful and something that I would recommend you do for your own marketing. I'm going to let our clients do the talking for us. If you are currently thinking about marketing for your consultancy, you're going to want to listen to this.
Create Engage started the process for us. They managed it end to end. They came up with some really creative ideas and we were really happy with the work that they did, which meant that we could just focus on running the business. Not only did we start conversations with clients that we hadn't spoken to before, but also there was tangible return on investment by some work that we were given.
They've helped right from the initial shaping of the idea through to helping us work out what our end goal was. They've supported us with the visual identity and our positioning of the brand.
We've had an immediate expansion of our network and have initiated a raft of new conversations with owners, CEOs in target client organisations, and has led to us winning new projects already.
One of the greatest compliments, I guess, is that one of our competitors even said that they really like what we're doing with marketing and they wish they could be doing something as good.
So from our perspective, we couldn't recommend Create Engage any more than this.
I would certainly recommend Create Engage if you're a consulting firm. They really understand consultancies and the sort of challenges we face. And I don't think you're going to get much better marketing anywhere else.
So I wouldn't hesitate to recommend Create Engage. They did a really good job for us.
So if you're looking for an agency that can help you achieve the results that our clients just described, then head to our website, createengage.co.uk, where you can find out more about how we support consulting firms like you. You can download our latest ebook and you can get in touch to talk about how we can help you take your consultancy to the next level through digital marketing. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Climbing Consulting. If you have any guest recommendations, comments, ideas, thoughts on how I can make this show better for you, just drop me an email. It's nick@createengage.co.uk, and I really look forward to hearing from you.